Today is Sunday, and it is Aleph Tammuz, Reish Chodesh Tammuz, Aleph Tammuz, and I want you to know that this is an important day in the Chabad calendar for reasons that people are not Mesim Lev. The Rebbe spoke about this. Reish Chodesh Tammuz, 90 years ago, was Friday. Gimel Tammuz, 90 years ago, was Sunday. Okay, so in other words, it's staggered by 2 days. This year, Yud Beis Tammuz is going to be on a Thursday. 90 years ago, when the Rebbe Rayatz was released from prison, it was on a Tuesday. This is the 90th anniversary. Tzadik Shana. It's the 90th anniversary since the previous Rebbe's arrest and liberation. It's a very, very long time. It's a very long time. I don't mean to say in the sense that we're far away from it. It means that we've had 90 Yud Beis Tammuzes with all the implications of Yud Beis Tammuz. But the reason today is important because, as we all know the story, it's really a remarkable story. When they arrested the Frierdiker Rebbe, when the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested, it was Achaz Doseh. His fate was already sealed. And it was a combination of factors. Again, you have to piece together all the pieces, and I believe in the book Early Years, they have a little bit about this. The book Early Years, which is a very, very good book, because it's very well sourced, everything has a mucker that you can trace, is about the Rebbe. It's not about the Frierdiker Rebbe. But there's, of course, enormous overlap between the Rebbe and the Frierdiker Rebbe. It can't be any other way.
You want water?
I'm fine, thank you very much. I'll say it. In any case, but there's a lot about the Rebbe's involvement with the Frierdiker Rebbe, and you can see their sources of what was going on at the time when the Rebbe was arrested. The Frierdiker Rebbe had done certain things to really infuriate the Sektia and the KGB at that time. Besides for the fact that he was involved in Yiddishkeit and he had Chadorim, which they knew, he was also defying them. They called a meeting to try and pacify Rabbonim. So the Frierdiker Rebbe made a separate meeting in a place called Kurdistan. And the whole point was to underscore that there is a Sifas HaRabbonim and a Sifas HaRabbonim. And it was very defiant. And it gets involved, there's a lot of sensitive aspects, there's a lot of personal aspects. But that was one thing. Another thing that actually happened was that a Russian agent in a foreign land was shot and killed. I don't know the Prati Adava, but somebody, a very, very important communist overseas was killed, and a decision was made to round up a certain number of clergy and shoot them. That was very simple. It was a political decision to teach the West, whoever it was that was responsible for that assassination, a lesson. The Rebbe was on that list. The Frierdiker Rebbe was on the list of clergy. That night they arrested some very, very important Lahavdol clergy and shot him. And it wasn't about them. It was about something that had happened someplace else in a statement. The Rebbe was on that list. There's a lot of factors that came together. And of course, the miracle of the story, as the Frierdiker Rebbe himself describes it, he was told to go to a room. But he said, nobody told him what time he has to get there. So he sat down to have a cigarette. Now you tell me who has that kind of presence of mind. And the cigarette, the time that he sat meditating was enough time for a number of things to happen to change the situation. It's a nefgole. The Rebbe Rayatz, the Frierdiker Rebbe, said about his arrest and liberation, that from the moment he was arrested until the moment he was released, he was not 1 minute without his father, the Rebbe Rashab. As I think is okay. He was not 1 minute without his father, the Rebbe Rashab. And this Pashat Nisim Gluyim. Nisim Gluyim. The Rebbe by Fabrengen repeated that the Frierdiker Rebbe told him, or maybe he said about Rabbi, that when he was cross-examined, he would lean over to look and see what's written on the papers. And he saw on his file a line, that was crossed out. Then there was a second line which said 10 years of slave labor in Solofki, and that was crossed out. And then it said on the third line, 3 years of Golus and Kastrama. So the Rebbe said that the Rebbe Rashver, the Frierdiker Rebbe, did not want to say what was written on the first line, because it was B'chaim Chayosei Bal Ma'adein Agashmi during his physical lifetime. But the Rebbe surmised, the Rebbe understood that on the first line it was written that they were going to shoot him. Rahman al-Islam. Then that was changed. V'chulu v'chulu. The Frierdiker Rebbe spent about 18 days. He counts the hours that he spent in Shpalerke. And what they did to him in those 18 days, physically, with them, they beat him over and over again, physically, with such a cruelty. It's indescribable. The Frierdiker Rebbe physically was never the same. But to Mazik, in 18 days, they did such damage to his goof. It's indescribable. Now the Frierdiker Rebbe didn't help. Why? Because he had an official stance of defiance. And the Rebbe told us by Fabrengen, and you can read it in the Frierdiker Rebbe's accounts, the Frierdiker Rebbe decided that he's not mispoven. And he got many beatings just because of his refusal to cooperate. For example, there was a policy in Russia that when you're given an official word, whether it's a judgment or it's a change of direction, you had to stand. And they would come into his cell. He had 3 roommates, Goyim. They would come into his cell and they would tell him, Stelzach, stand up. And the Rebbe wouldn't stand up. First of all, he refused to speak in Russian. He insisted on speaking in Yiddish. Half the people in that workplace were Yidden, whose Yiddish was first language. Many of them were ex-yeshiva bacharim. It was very tragic. It was really the worst circumstance of Jew on Jew hatred that you could even imagine. Without Yidden. And he wouldn't stand. And they told him, if you don't stand up, we'll hit you. He says, and they beat him. 1 time, 2 times, until they couldn't hit him anymore. So they told him they're calling him to the office. No, they're calling to the office. So he went to the office, because this is not an act of covet. So, but he walked into the office, he was standing by default. He didn't have a chance to sit down. So that's how they gave him, they destroyed his goof, indescribably. Anyway, but it was finally decided he's going to leave the Russian prison and go up to 3 years of exile on a Friday. And there were rules about this trip. The rules were that he could either travel on a government penny, to travel on a government arrangement, the transportation, or if he could afford it, he could travel in his own way and pay his own ticket. And the Rebbe preferred to travel by himself. So he was given 6 hours. 6 hours from the time he left the prison cell till he had to be in the train station to leave the city of Leningrad and go to Kostroma. And so they told him on Friday that he can go home. Friday, which is a Shchedish Tammuz, which is why this conversation started. With a Shchedish Tammuz, he can go home for 6 hours and take a train and go to Kostroma. And then there's a bunch of rules about how he had to report and so on. And the Rebbe calculated that he would have to travel on Shabbos. So the Rebbe said, can he suspend it till after Shabbos? I said, no, this is the way it works. If you leave the cell and this hour, you have 6 hours and you immediately have to leave. So the Rebbe said, if that's the case, I'll stay here for 2 more days. Till Sunday Gimel Tammuz. Now, it's impossible to appreciate how reckless an act that was. 48 more hours. You ever see the Frierdiker Rebbe Shimas HaMaiser? Meseches Gehenim, Perek Rishon. Meseches Gehenim, Perek Sheni. The Frierdiker Rebbe is describing his experiences. He goes at Meseches, the tractate of Gehinom. You know what that is, yeah? Chapter 1, Meseches Gehenim, Perek Beis. It was Mama Shiva Madura. It was Gehenim. And you say 48 more hours. In those 48 more hours, so many things could have happened. But the Rebbe wasn't going to go. He wasn't going to travel Shabbos. That's why it came out Gimel Tammuz. Gimel Tammuz was on a Sunday. And the same thing happened on Sunday. Sunday he was given 6 hours, he went home. He spent 6 hours with his family and he went to the train station. And of course everybody knows the story that the Rebbe had given specific instructions that nobody should be in the train station, nobody should come. When he comes to the train station, there were tens of thousands of Yidden. That's the nobody. Every person who stood on that platform that day was gambling with his life. They came to see the Rebbe off. There's a story. There was a chassid by the name of Nissen Nemenov. I'm married to a Nemenov. Yeah. The Rebbe asked, "Is Nissen da?" He was a bocher. Is Nissen da? So they told him that the Rebbe said, "No, every Lubavitcher chassid in the world was there." Is Reb Nissen here? So the Rebbe said, "Not to be here. He was the only one who didn't show up." So the Rebbe said, as a Zaydin soldat, I think. The Rebbe was very impressed that he followed orders. He was the only one. The Rebbe said he shouldn't be in the train station, so he wasn't in the train station. Kabbalah sailed. That was his thing. So the end of the story was that the Frierdiker Rebbe turns around and he sees all these people and he says, "I can't just wave." So he stepped forward and he made a talk, a speech, which he later wrote himself. It's 1 page. The Rebbe made from this in Maimorim. It was a sikha. It started with the pasuk, "Hi Hashem Elokeinu imanu kasher hayam aviseinu Al Yazvein Al Yachenu. It's unbelievably powerful. It's one page. And it was a sikha, it was a talk on Mesiras Nefesh. In other words, the Rebbe knew how dangerous it is for him. He knew how dangerous it is for everybody else. It would have been better if he went quietly. But if Yidden were Mesiras Nefesh, and that's exactly what it was, Pasha to see the Rebbe off, he could not do anything. So he spoke about the Yidden Mesiras Nefesh. And he said very powerful things. Of course, the highlight of that one page, a lot of it was a quote from the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek had said almost 74 years earlier, 74, 75, Taf Reish Gimel, there was a famous meeting where the Tzemach Tzedek also was put into a very narrow space. And the Tzemach Tzedek said that we were not asked if we want to go into Golus. We're not being asked when we're going out of Golus. But Golus is only for the body. Golus has nothing to do with the Neshama. When it comes to the Yiddish and Neshama, so a Yid says, I'll take Ubimshicha, Ubimviyah. It's none of your business. A Goy in Goyishkeit has no business in Yiddishkeit, and particularly, of course, as the issue was at that time, Yiddish chinuch, how you rear Yiddish kindalach, is nobody's business but the Jews. This is the story. So, the beginning of the story is Rosh Chodesh. Today is Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. That when he refused to leave his jail cell and opted to spend 48 more hours in prison so that he shouldn't travel on Shabbos. So the Rebbe spoke about it. I think there's a sikha, where the Rebbe questions the halachic legitimacy of this. Everybody knows that pikuach nefesh deicha kol ateidah kula. When a person's life is in danger, there's no Shabbos. Or to say it in Lomdish, in Yeshivas, this is keeping Shabbos. Desecrating the Shabbos to save a life is keeping Shabbos. The Rebbe's life was in mortal danger. Every minute behind those walls was a sakon and nafshis. How did the previous Rebbe take that achrayus of spending 48 more days in jail when he knew that he could literally not survive those 48 hours? I'll tell you the Nekudas HaDavid. The Nekudas HaDavid is the following. I'm going to give you Hagdama. That by Avraham Avinu we find the same kasha. Avraham Avinu mamish the same kasha. It says in the Torah, Vayitein Avraham es kol asher lo liYitzchak. Avraham Avinu gave everything he owned to his son, to Yitzchak Avinu. When did he do it? He did it when Yitzchak got married. It's written in the Torah a little bit later, but he did it when Yitzchak got married. Yitzchak got married when Avraham was 137. Avraham lived 175. So do the math. Avraham Avinu would live another 38 years from the time, right? 38? From the time he wrote this document until his histalkus, till he passed away. So the halacha is that a person is not allowed to give away everything he owns to tzedakah. You're not allowed to do it. A person is not allowed to give away all his wealth to tzedakah. Why? Because then you become a tzedakah. Then you become a dependent. And you're not allowed to put yourself in a position where you're taking more tzedakah. If a person needs to take tzedakah, he's mechuyev to take tzedakah, and he's not allowed to not take tzedakah. And if he refuses, you have to trick him. You know the halacha is, if someone doesn't want to take tzedakah, you know what he needs. So you give him a loan, and you forget to collect it. This is a din in Shulchan Aruch. If a person is so self-respecting and so responsible, if you take $1 from somebody, you have to feel you're able to return it. And if you don't feel you can return it, you don't want to take it. And you can push a starve. So there's way you have to fool that person into taking tzedakah. But if a person has to give away what he has and to end up becoming a tzedakah, is us. So the Rebbe asked this question also: how did Avraham Avinu give away everything he had to Yitzchak? And the answer, B'kitz and Nimrat, was because there was no reality to Avraham Avinu other than Yitzchak. You're not allowed to give away what you have to somebody else. Yitzchak was Avraham. Now, how was Yitzchak Avraham? Because Avraham's whole Metzias, his entire Metzias, was his purpose. His purpose was to spread Yiddishkeit, to spread Achdas Hashem, to teach Arvim, Shemishtachavim, La'avok, Shalgaber, Agleim, Bar Hashem Echad. This was his whole Metzias. There was simply nobody left other than that mission. That purpose was perpetuated, was continued in Yitzchak. So since there was no Metzias, there was simply no reality of Avraham Avinu beyond teaching the world about the Eibishter, and Yitzchak was continuing Avraham Avinu's work, so this was giving away everything he had to himself. Now what did he eat after he gave away everything to Yitzchak? Don't worry about it. Yeah, Yitzchak was not a son, but he was a reasonable son. His father didn't lack for anything. I'm not asking the question on a technical level. On a principle level, how did Avraham give away? You're not allowed to give away all of your wealth. Avraham was able to. Why? because he gave away all of his wealth to himself. And himself was a ruchniistic purpose. No human being can say, I have no life. Every human being has a life and a mission. Abraham Avinu's life was his mission. There was nothing outside of Abraham Avinu's mission that was part of Abraham Avinu's life. So he was an exception to the rule. He gave away everything. And the Rebbe said the same is true of the Friedrich Rebbe. The Friedrich Rebbe was a Nasi B'Yisrael. And I'm not going to go into the Arichas Hadavar, but because he was a Nasi B'Yisrael, his inyan is Yidden. His inyan is Yiddishkeit. So when the Friedrich Rebbe says that he's risking his life not to be Mechalel Shabbos, in a case where in Halacha, you're not only permitted to be Mechalel Shabbos, you're obligated to be Mechalel Shabbos. The reason that Rebbe was able to do it, because if not for Shabbos, he has no life. There's, by a Rebbe, by a Nasi B'Yisrael, there simply is no life outside of Yiddishkeit, especially under those conditions. You know, we all know the story with the Alter Rebbe, that the Rebbe Tzachik Koch, how the Alter Rebbe went on Yom Kippur, and chopped wood, and made a fire, and cooked a soup, and fed the Yeldis. Yeah, that's Chil Shabbos, right? That's Chil Shabbos, Shabbos, and Yom Kippur. That's a different story, yeah? But when it's a question of Chil Shabbos, where the emphasis is on the word Chilul, and not on the word Shabbos, so the Rebbe couldn't be Mechal Shabbos. In other words, this is his Matthias. He has no Matthias other than Shmirat Shabbos, especially since he knew how Yidden are watching, how he behaved. Anyway, so this happened in Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, a very, very significant event happened in the story of the Friedrich Rebbe's arrest and liberation. And today is 90 years, so we're marking it, we're talking about it. Now, let's get to Tanya. Okay, we're learning Tanya today. And we're in the beginning of Perek Beis. Now, what we did, this is our third class on Perek Beis, and we're holding on the first line. We are very talented around here. Okay? Well, the first week, 2 classes ago, we did a big piece. We probably did 10 or 12 lines. And I overviewed, the way I'm teaching it to you, the 2 proofs for the idea that a neshama, nefesh hashenis, is chelik l'kam mimal mamish. There are 2 proofs to the idea that a neshama is a piece of Hashem mimal mamish. The first is a pasuk in Chumash, vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. That's what we're going to learn this morning. He blew into his nostrils a breath of life. And the second is a medrash. Yisrael alu v'machshava. The Jewish people enter in the machshava of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when we started the Perek, I read a lot because I wanted to summarize the idea that the Alter Rebbe is bringing 2 proofs, 2 different proofs to this concept of the neshama being chelik al-imam. After we did that, so last week we started from the beginning again, and we read 4 words, chelik al-imam mamish. That was last week's class. So we're going to continue reading, and if you forgive me for starting from the beginning of the Perek and wasting your time, okay? Perek Beis, v'nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. The second nefesh that a yid has is chelik al-imam mamish, a portion of alakah, of godliness, mimal, from above, mamish, no, that ever brings an emes. This is from Ramak, that alakah is 4 letters, Keil, Vovke. The word alakah, it's from Kabbalah. Keil, Aleph, Lamed, Vovke, the last 2 letters of the Eibishter's name. And in the word alakah itself, the Rebbe sees the 2 opposites of the highest of the high and the lowest of the low, as we discussed last week at length. This is what the Shaitan Pasuk, it doesn't Chumash. Vayipach b'yapov nishmas chayim. And he blew into his nostrils. His means Adam Arishan, and as we discussed at length 2 weeks ago, Adam Arishan means Adam and Chava. Adam and Chava, the Gemara says, you patzufim nivru. Adam and Chava were created as one person, with 2 bodies attached, back to back. I don't want to repeat the class that I gave, but Chava was not created from Adam. Chava was created with Adam, and they were separated. The operation that you read about in the Chumash was simply to separate them. But Adam and Chava were created together, and when it says in the Torah he blew into his nostrils a breath of life, it means Adam and Chava. So then, of course, Adam and Chava are Jews, but that's it. They have a Yiddish neshama, they have a godly soul, nobody else. So he brings from the Siddur. It says in Alakai Neshama, which we say every day in davening, you blew into me. Which means that it's not only true of Adam and Chava, every Yid has the same idea that the Eibishter gives him a neshama, and the neshama that the Eibishter gives him is b'derech nefich. He blows into him a breath of life, the union of nefich Hashem blows. Now, of course, Kabbalistically, technically, for the techno-Kabbalists, and of course everybody here's a Greisa Makovo, yeah, Adam and Chava were even. Their children were b'nei Nech. Now, how you could be a ben Neach before Neach was born, that's a special trick, but that's the mitzvah. Adam and Chava had Yiddish and Neshamas, had godly souls. Their children who were born after the Chet Tzaddas did not. Avraham Avinu had a Yiddish and Neshama. Avraham Avinu also had a Yiddish and Neshama, and from there starts the inyan of Yidden. It's complicated. What about the Shvatim? Were they Jewish? Were they not Jewish? It is certain that they did not have a Jewish goof. The Shvatim for sure did not have a Jewish goof. Whether they had a Jewish Neshama, I don't know, but a Yiddish goof. This happened by Yitzias Mitzrayim and Matan Torah. Ata v'chatonim mikol ha'amim, the goof of a Yid, the difference in a Yiddish goof and a Goyish goof began at Har Sinai. So Adam and Chava had Yiddish and Neshamas because they were born before the Chet, they were created before the Chet, and the Yiddish and Neshamas, the next person to have a Neshama, which we call L'chelik L'kami Ma'al Mamish, was Avraham Avinu. I don't know if I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, but I'm going to mention it now. There is a Taisvis, I was once at a Fabrengen, and he told a Moed in the Kavard. So, it's one of those things that if you're Lubavitch, you have to know about this Taisvis. I'm not going to give you the whole pilpul because you're not interested, it's not important. The bottom line is a Taisvis in Masechta Nida that says Befedish, that until the Eibush separated the Jewish people from the descendants of Adam and Neach, every goy is a shtikl yid. You heard what I said? I'll say it again. Adam and Chava had Yiddish and Neshamas. Avram was a yid. Until the Eibush that chose the Jewish people at Har Sinai, every goy was a potential yid. There's a certain aspect associated with Elokus, and there's a nafkamina poshet lahalacha lamais. There's differences in dinim. That's where the Taisvis comes in. Even Tumah v'Tara, until Hashem separated from all of the people on this earth, all the descendants of Adam and Ishmael, all the descendants of Noach, the Jewish people, every guy has the potential to be a Yid because the Chelik Elakami Mal was woven into the mix, as it were. Adam and Chava had a Chelik Elakami Mal Mamish. And in their children it was complicated, and then Avraham Avinu was a Yid, and Sarah was a Yid, and Yitzchak and Rivka and so on. And by Matan Torah, they created the Jewish people. As it relates to us, we say every day in davening, "Va'atan afachtabi," you blew into me. We didn't write those words, right? Whoever wrote them knew what they were writing, so it's true. So just like Adam and Chava were Yidden, and had a Chelik Elakami Mal, a special Neshama, which is a part of Elokus, and the Raya is that Hashem blew, the same is true for each one of us, because it says in Siddur that the Eibishter blew a Neshama into us, and we continue to read. On this idea of Ayipach in Bereshit, it says in the Zohar, "Man de nafach mitechir nafach." When one blows, they blow from their depth. Pirush, this means your innermost and your deepest self is expressed when one blows. The inners, the depth of a person, of the life within a person, moitzi is brought out, is brought forward when one blows with kech, one blows with strength. Okay, so vayipach means a person blows mit dem ganzen kech. So now, let me start this conversation like this. In Chassidus, there is a discussion which is called Gvura. Chassidus has many discussions. And people who know, not that many people know, you know that everything has a place. Chassidus has sugyas, Chassidus has topics. You have to just know where to find what. There is a sugy in Chassidus that explains Gevuras in a lot of places. How does Gevura work? What is the concept of Gevura? And it's involved. But one of the things that's brought up when it comes to the issue of Gevura is this Vayipach. Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim has to do with Gevura. And what it says, this is found in Samach Vav. That's where I know it from. And it's brought in other places as well. What's the Taich Vayipach? And I'll explain it to you in these words. There's a medrash where the medrash says that a gibber, a very big warrior, a strong fellow, comes into a Medina, comes into a country. Nobody knows who he is. And he wants to announce himself. He wants people to know that he's a gibber, that he's a strong man, that he's a very, very physically fit person. But nobody knows who he is. So if nobody knows who he is, how is he going to demonstrate his gevuras? So he goes around showing off. How does he show off? He runs around and he finds anything heavy and turns it over. He sees a stone, he turns it over. He sees a bigger stone. The Lashon HaMelech says, but he turns over everything he sees to show people how strong he is. What happens if he can lift the heaviest thing there is to lift? If he can pick up the heaviest rock, there's simply nothing heavier for him to lift. If he's able to lift the heaviest rock, you don't know the end of his strength. If you want to know the end of a person's strength, you say he can lift so many pounds, but he cannot lift more. If he's able to lift the heaviest rock, you don't know the edge of his gvura. This is the mashal. And the nimshal is, there's a neshama in Gan Eden. And neshamas in Gan Eden lift rocks, lift boulders, to demonstrate what the neshama is. And you never know the gvura of the neshama. What the full strength of a neshama is never known. In other words, not only don't other neshamas and malachim or whatever exists in Elam Yisrael know the strength of a neshama, the neshama doesn't know its own strength. Because the gevura of the neshama is greater than anything that is challenging them in Elam Yisrael. You know this, right? One of those wonderful insights. V'alakim nisas Avraham. You learned Chumash, yeah? V'alakim nisas Avraham. The Eibush that tests Avraham Avinu. They say in Chumash, right? So all the Mefarshim ask, why did he give him a test? He wanted to know how well he was going to do. The Eibush didn't know how Avraham Avinu would do when he would give him a test. The Eibush knows, right? Imagine a teacher who gives his students a test and he knows how well the students are doing. What would be the point to give a student a test if you know how well the student is doing? So there's many answers, and one of them is that the student should know how well he's doing. Right? Well, the Kim Nisa has many translations. One of them is he raised him up. At the Uiftohib, and he lifted him up. But another translation is he showed him off. And at them Givizim, he wanted people to know who Avraham Avinu was. The only way people would find out who Avraham Avinu was by giving him a test. This is the pshat. A person has strength, the neshama has strength, and doesn't know the edges of its own strength. This is the pshat gvura. Vayipach ba'apach nishmas chaim. The Eibishter blows the neshama into this world. This is an act of gevura on the Eibishter's part. It's an act of gevura because it involves a tzimtzum. The Eibishter has to squeeze a gigantic neshama into a tiny goof, and they should work. The gigantic neshama and the tiny goof should have a state of harmony. I've always told you the story. At the Mittel Rebbe, the night that he was nostalgic, the night of the Mittel Rebbe's nostalgic, he was in a dveikus. And the Hasidim became very nervous, and he started screaming. So when the Mittel Rebbe came out of his dveikus, the Hasidim asked him if he heard what they were saying. They were pushing, screaming in panic when they saw him going into this dveikus, because the Mittel Rebbe did this on a regular basis. But he did it and nobody saw. Here we did it in front of everybody. So the Mittel Rebbe said, yeah, ich hab gehört, was tucht. I heard. But he didn't hear them. He heard what is such a great soul doing in such a lowly world. The Mittel Rebbe said, ich hab gehört, was tut. What is such a lofty soul doing in such a lowly world? Now that's the Mittel Rebbe. But in a very basic way, in a closed way, every neshama is a grace neshama in a nidirik avel. It takes gvura. It takes gvura on the Eibishter's part to create that possibility for two opposites to exist. But the other side of the coin is also gvura. What's the other side of the coin? The gvura of the neshama is only realized when a neshama comes into Elam Hazeh. In other words, vayipach, when a person blows, he blows with all of his strength. So on the one hand, blowing up with his strength means the strength of the Eibishter Kvayachol to have made such a tzimtzum. But in addition, there is also the strength that only when the neshama comes into this world is the strength of the neshama materialized. The gevura of a neshama is simply not known in Gan Eden because there's nothing to challenge it. This is what we discussed last week also about chelik elakami mal mamish. The trick of a neshama is not how holy he is, or she is, how great she is. The trick of a neshama is that the neshama is holy enough and great enough to be a neshama in this world. And that's a pella. And all of this is included in the word vayipach. The word vayipach connotes that the Eibishter blew with strength, so that the strength has two parts. One aspect of the strength is the strength of the Eibishter to squeeze a big neshama into a tiny goof, into a dark world. And the other aspect of the Gevura is that this will reveal the koyach of a neshama. The koyach of a neshama is revealed in Elam Hazeh. Now you and I don't exactly see it that way, right? Why? Because when we look at our own lives, we say, What inefficiency? You take a neshama from Gan Eden and you put him into this world, and he or she does whatever they do, right? It's nit pashut. So this question is already asked in Tanya. I've talked about this recently, I think last week. Yeah? In Peirik Lamed Hey, and in Peirik Lamed Aleph, where the Alter Rebbe says, Lo Ma'asa, I told you last Sunday. Actually read it inside. Lo Ma'asa Avaya Kocha. What's the point of taking such a godly entity and putting it into such an environment where it's going to fail? It's not going to win. And the answer is, the Eibush has a different point of view. And from the Eibush's perspective, a neshama beguf is a gibber. The Ein Seif of a neshama seen in this world, in the what we correctly consider, the little that it does, you see Ein Seif. In other words, when a neshama raises its head of all of the halamas vestadim that this world brings to the neshama, there is more strength in that than the neshama in the highest madregas of Gan Eden, because there is simply no opposition. And both of these ideas are included by Yipach. The Eibishter used Gevura to blow a neshama into a guf, and in using Gevura to blow a neshama into a guf, he's revealing the potential, the Ein Seif of a neshama. As I discussed last week at length, only a neshama could be in this world. Only a neshama is an entity which is spiritual and godly to be in this world, not because it's low enough, but because it's so high that it can bridge opposites. That's a taich by Yipach. Okay? Now, let's give it now. Pirish HaPashut, right? Let me read the words one more time. Why not? Yeah. It says, "Vayipach b'apav nishmas chaim." The Eibush blew into his nostril the breath of life. V'atan afachta bi. In Siddur it says that you blew the neshama into me. U'k'mei shekasa b'zeyad. And it says in Zeyad, "Man the nafach miteichi nafach." One who blows with innermost parts. Pirush miteichi. You say, the deepest levels of a person are extracted in one blows. Sheteichias or pnimias achayas adam, the deepest levels of life. And a person might say he brings forward benefichasa b'keach when he blows with koyach. So let's talk pshuta shamikri. Yeah, pashtus balabatish. What's the simple pshat here? The simple pshat here is that everybody knows that the Eibishter created the world with speech. The Eibishter created the world with dibur, right? As they say to Chumash, Vayemer Elokim, Vayemer Elokim, Vayemer Elokim. And it says in Medrashim, it says in Mishnah, that there was Son of Mamaras. The Eibishter spoke 10 times, whatever those 10 utterances were, in order to create the world. So of course everybody understands that the Eibishter doesn't have a mouth, and the Eibush doesn't actually speak. You're talking about Elokus. So it's a mashal. It's a mashal, it's a metaphor. The Torah uses form that we're able to relate to, describing creation as an act of speech. Like today's chitas and Tanya begins, to make it a little bit easier for us to relate to, for a little more palatable. Creation is described as speech, even though Hashem is not talking like I'm talking to you. There's no such musik by the Eibishter. Nevertheless, even though we understand that when the Torah described the Eibishter as creating the world through speech, he didn't actually speak. But the mashal is daimel nimshal, right? The fact that the Eibishter chose the form of speech is precise. So what does speech teach us about how the Eibishter created the world? In other words, once we accept that he didn't actually get up on a soapbox, make an announcement. He didn't speak. But Beruchnis, it's an Indian of thee, but it's a concept of speech. What is the concept of speech with which the Eibishter created the world? So the first point is that when a person speaks, the words that they say go out of them. When you think a thought, the thoughts remain inside your head. When you speak words, something comes from inside of you and goes outside of you. And in Gashmi, it's very simply spatial. Spatial means it has to do with makom, with space. You're in one space, and you speak words, and the words go out of the space you're in, into the space which is around where you are, right? Simple. And of course, you know this book, actually, the Maimonides for the Tliidi Kedav never repeats it, the idea that when you speak a word, it's spoken forever. That spoken word reverberates, it travels and travels and travels and travels. It never goes away. Everything that a person said is constantly being said. Now, it's going to be kind of hard to hear a sikha from 50 or 60 years ago, or to go back and listen to a conversation about Avraham Avinu because of interference. But when you say something, you make a physical effect in the world around yourself, which theoretically, in Amitas Anyanim, goes on forever. The concept of the Eibishter speaking assumes that there's makom, that there's a space. And Tayochel, the Eibishter, is in one space, and the world is in a different space, and the Eibishter speaks. He projects from what's inside of him to what's outside of him into a space where he, Tayochel, isn't. That's the metaphor of Dibur. The reason we describe creation as the Eibishter speaking is because we have to imagine, have to understand the notion of space, Mokim. And Tayochel, the Eibishter, is here. And the world that the Eibishter creates is there, is someplace else, where Klayachal he is not. And words are traveling, so to speak, from where the Eibishter is to where the world is. That's the mashal of Dibur. Of course, the complication with this, as we all understand, is that we believe there's no such thing. First of all, by the Eibishter, there's B'chal no Mokum. Hashem doesn't have space. If Hashem doesn't have space, how could you say he's here or there? That's foolish to start with. And second of all, if you say that there's a space where the Eibishter is not, that's terrible. That's Hebrachtas, right? Hashem has to be everywhere. So what's the mashal? What does it mean the Eibishter speaks? And again, using a very, very physical understanding of it, just like when a human being speaks. The words go from inside of him, the makom that he is in, to a makom outside of him, where he is not. How could you say this by the Eibishter? And to make a long story short, this is what Chassidus calls Tzimtzum Shaloi Kipshuta. Tzimtzum Shaloi Kipshuta in English means space Shaloi Kipshuta. That's how I translate it in today's conversation. Tomorrow I'll tell you a different type. Right? The idea that there is a space where the Eibishter isn't, and that the Eibishter speaks, and the words of the Eibishter move from where he is to where he is not true. There's no such thing as a space where the Eibishter isn't, but in our perception it is. Right? Why do you say Hashem spoke when he created the world? And he's taking something from inside of himself to outside of himself, because we feel in our experience where we are, the Eibishter is not. This is how we experience it. To the Eibishter is everywhere, so he never really spoke. This is discussed in Tanya Perikaf Aleph. But to us, we are in a space where the Eibishter Vayachal isn't. At least he's not revealed. And the Eibishter speaks in order to create the world. So the first aspect of the mashal of Dibur, the first point of the idea that the Eibishter creates the world with speech, is that he's projecting from where he is into another space. But the emes is he's everywhere. There's no inside the Eibishter, there's no outside the Eibishter. In fact, by the Eibishter is B'chlal no Mokim. But the vart is that in our perception, we are in a space where he is not, Kvayachol, that's our perception. And he creates us through speech. That's point one. And then comes point 2 and point 3. The second point is that when a person speaks, they say one thing at a time. You can't say everything at once. Some people try. I've tried. Yeah, it doesn't work so good. It's like speaking with a mouthful of marbles. Nothing comes out. You can only say one thing at a time. You can think much faster than you can speak. Theoretically, in your imagination, you can think everything at once. You can just visualize, picture. But when a person speaks, he can only say one thing at a time. And of course, the nimshal for this second aspect of describing creation as speech is the Eibishter made a world that's divided up into parts. His chalkus, division, one thing at a time. On Sunday he made light, and on Monday he made division, and on Tuesday he made the land and the sea, and he made plants, and on Wednesday he made the stars and the sun and the moon, and so on and so forth. It was division. The Eibishter made the world in specific aspects, and in general it's 10 Asarim Amoros. And specifically, it's much, much more than 10. 10 is only a generalization. It's only a klal. And befrat, it's so much more. The Eibishter created the world with an incredible amount of variety and diversity and distinctness. And this is the second reason we use the illusion of Dibur. The second reason we use the illusion of Dibur is because just like a person can only say one thing at a time, the Eibishter created a divided world. Everything was created on a different day. Everything was created individually, and so on and so on. That's number 2. And then there's number 3. And the number 3 is that when a person speaks, there's 2 parts to the words. There are the sounds, the different sounds, and there is the amplification. The air that makes it heard. Right? When I was a little boy, we had a record player. May he or she rest in peace, I don't know. Remember record players? Okay, so we had a record player. Now if you have a record player, and you're an Olataidanik, and you're curious, you know this. That a record player comes along with speakers. Okay? Now if you turn off the speakers and you put on the record, I know this because I tried this, one of my great experiments, and you put your ear to the needle, you'll hear the sound. Remember there was a needle on a record? And there was a record spinning around. Nobody knew how the needle knew how to walk across that record in circle and line. We couldn't figure out how they do that. Yeah, how they do that. Now, a record is about this big and has a bunch of circles, hundreds and hundreds of circles. Now you can put millions of circles into this much space. We don't even know what's going on in that little teeny tiny space. But records were very impressive to us. Why? It was big enough for us to see how amazing a record is. Remember records? Yeah, there's a bunch of lines. And how the lines work, they're not a circle inside a circle. It's one long circle, like a spring. Each circle, that's why the record moves. Wow, isn't that incredible? Yeah? I'm very proud of myself. If you would listen to the record where the needle is on the record, you would hear sound, but nobody else could hear it. Why? Because you need hevel, you need air, you need amplification. And the same is true in the human speech. A person speaks. Speech is made up of sounds, vowels and consonants. And it's also made up of bellows, right? Of the lungs. They blow wind against the vocal cords, so the sound is reaching the end of the room. Or depending on how powerful a person's voice is, how far their voice will travel, etc., etc., etc. It's an ananda pasha. But that's the fact of life. When a person speaks, there are the individual sounds, which speaks to the thing I said earlier. You say one sound at a time, one word at a time, one sentence at a time, one thought at a time, and so on. And when you speak, you amplify your words with air. Now imagine a person ran 10 miles and is panting, trying to catch their breath, and they try to tell you good morning. How does that good morning come out? For most people, it doesn't come out at all. Yeah. Why? There's too much air. There's too much air. For the air which comes from the lungs to hit against the vocal cords, which are called in Torah the mitzvah sapeh, to produce sound, the air has to be modulated, has to be controlled. If there's too much air, there's no sound, or there's no words. You can blow, but if there's too much hevel, there's too much air coming out of the lungs, and of course, if you've learned Chassidus, you know we never attribute the air to the lungs. We attribute the air to the heart. We don't call it hevel areya. We call it hevel alev, the air of the lungs, of the heart. Pardon me. There are places in Chassidus where they say, the truth is air comes from the lungs, but this is why we say that air comes from the heart, because a spoken word has warmth, choim, chmimis, warmth. You can't speak without warmth, and the warmth has to do with the blood. That's why we call it hevel alev, not hevel areya. When you speak, the air technically comes from the lungs. In Torah, the air comes from the heart. In order for words to be spoken, the air has to be limited. If a person is healthy and they have control over their respiration, sometimes a person is too weak, they don't have enough air, they have too much air, whatever the case is, you can't speak. You can't speak in a normal voice. You'll either speak in a whisper, or you'll speak in a shout, or your words will be confused. When a person speaks in a reasonable and normal way, they have to control the air. And in the Nimshal, the spoken word has a chomer and a tzura. It has a body and a soul. One aspect of the speech is the sounds, the words and the sounds themselves. And the other aspect of the speech is the air which amplifies the sound. Now let me do a quick question. Which is chomer and which is tzura? Is the air the chomer and the sound the tzura, or is the air the tzura and the sounds the chomer? If you'll think about it, you'll realize that you're stuck over here. Why? Because we all understand that the air is the pnimius and the sounds are the chitzonius. No, so if the air is the pnimius and sound is the chitzonius, it would stand to reason that air is tzura and sound is chitzonius. It's chomer. But on the other hand, chomer is simple and tzura is complex. The individual sounds are complicated. The air is the same in all. So you're stuck. You're stuck. So we're all stuck together. Let's forget about this question. I ask questions for one reason. You shouldn't be able to ask them. Okay, it's complicated. Which is the chomer and which is the tzura? When you speak words, you produce sounds. And the sounds are amplified by air. Which is representative of the goof of those sounds? And which is representative of the neshama of those sounds is complicated. The pashtus, you would think that the neshama is the sounds, because they're different. They're individual. And the air is the goof, because it's the same in every word. But on the other hand, the air is the pnimius. The air is the neshama. And the sounds is the goof. But okay, so we'll leave that question for experts. But this is how a person speaks. Now here's a simple point. Imagine saying words and blowing all the air out of your lungs at the same time. You're speaking words, you're saying words, and blowing all of your air of your lungs out at the same time. You cannot do that. It's physically impossible. If you're going to speak words, the air has to be b'mdida v'agbola. The air has to be limited, measured. If you're going to blow, you can blow. But you can't speak, right? Where do we know this from? From Tkiyas Shefer. Yeah, you remember Tkiyas Shefer? The modern of Tkiyas Shefer, there's two kinds of sound. There's limited sound and unlimited sound. Unlimited sound comes out either in a cry, a geshay, or in no voice at all. Limited sound, because it's limited, comes out in words. When the Eibishter created the world, He spoke. He spoke to create light, and He spoke to create the vision. He spoke to create the land and the sea. He spoke to create the plants. He spoke to create the fish. He spoke to create the me'edes. He spoke to create whatever else He created. The birds, and the mammals, and then man, and then the idea that that a person's redu but gas hayama shamayim, that man was created to dominate the earth. They're all included in Asaram Amaris through speech. When it came to Adam, it says Vayipach, he blew. Now you can struggle with this. You can wonder what's the pshat? And there's probably more than one way to understand it. And when I say probably, I don't mean you and I are going to figure out more than one way to understand it. In the Rishonim, you'll see more than one way to understand it. But at some point, you have two opposites. At some point, you're going to have to accept that when the Eibishter created a neshama, by blowing him into a guf, there's two opposites here. And the two opposites are blowing. Blowing means b'koyach. When a person blows, he blows with all of his strength. And if you blow with all of your strength, it doesn't come out in a measured way. It doesn't come out in a complex way. It doesn't come out in a sophisticated way. It comes out in a raw way. When the Eibishter blew the neshama into the guf, there's two opposites. On the one hand, the neshama is vayipach. The whole gevura of Atzmos Ein Sof is where the neshama comes into a guf, and at the same time, it's fine-tuned. It's very, very precise. And that's the type vayipach. That's the chiddush of vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. The Eibishter created a world through speech. He created Adam also through speech. But in creating Adam, there is an aspect which cannot happen in speech, as you know it and as I know it, that you speak and don't give out a limited amount of chayis, but the whole chayis of what Atzmos Hus is, maitzi b'nefichos le'bekeyah. This is what it says in the Pasuk, this is what it says in the Siddur, this is how the Alter Rebbe explains it based on the Zohar. So, this is a raya to chelik elokam imal mamash. That the Eibishter created Adam. He created many things, right? In the Chumash it says He created 10. Asaram Amaris. One of the Asaram Amaris is Adam and Chava. And He created them, He created all the other Amaris. Nasa Adam, let us make man. And so on and so forth. And then in the next pedic it says, how did He create man? That He made an operation, but it also says, He blew into Adam and Chava nishmas chaim, a breath of life. So Chassidus points out, this is a ninyaf and nimna nenoit. It's two opposites. That the whole of Atzmos Hus is found in a teeny tiny guf is a chibur of hafchim. It's two opposites in one place. Hashem speaks, and the air is not modulated. The whole Ein Sof of the Eibishter comes out in dibur, in a limited speech, which has to do with a particular neshama being in a particular guf in Elam Hazeh Agashmi. This is the first raya. This is the first proof to the idea of chelik elokam imal mamash. So Rebbe starts with the pedic. The nefesh Hashem is b'Yisrael. The second nefesh, which he has, chelik elokam imal mamash, is a piece of elokam imal mamash, and his raya is vayipach. This is the explanation of that proof. All of the Eibishter is invested in the way neshama comes into a group.